Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk on algorithmic impact assessments, a case for moving beyond mitigating harms. Today, I'm recording this talk in Canberra, Australia, which is on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I'd like to pay respect to the traditional owners of this land and all of the traditional owners on the lands where you're listening from today. Tyson Yuncker Porter, an Aboriginal scholar and founder of the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Lab, wrote this in his recent book, Sand Talk. Viewing the world through a lens of simplicity always seems to make things more complicated, but simultaneously less complex. An algorithmic impact assessment is a lens of simplicity, stripping out complexity in a quest to make the impacts of algorithms visible and digestible. But which bits do we keep and which bits do we shed? Today, we're going to explore what impact means in the current AIA landscape, or Algorithmic Impact Assessment is AIA. We're going to compare that meaning of impact to what's seen in other types of impact assessments. And then using Dr. Jenny Davis's mechanisms and conditions framework of affordances, we will unpack how the configuration of impact assessments shapes our behavior. We hope that this will open a conversation for those designing, using, and regulating algorithmic impact assessments in the future. Impacts can be thought of in many different ways. And for me, before coming to do my PhD at ANU, I spent 10 years in consulting and doing impact assessments for government programs or community organizations. And in this context, there was a big emphasis on positive impacts and looking at impacts through a systems lens. So I was surprised to notice that much of the discourse surrounding algorithmic impacts seems very focused on negative impacts or harms. And I wanted to dig into that. AIAs are an emerging field, and there are actually very few publicly available algorithmic impact assessments. But a report from the Ada Lovelace Institute in August 2021 classified these documents in the category of algorithmic impact assessment. And they've since published a healthcare-specific AIA in 2022. Now, upon looking at these tools, I noticed that these ones were all framed pretty much in terms of risk. They focus on negative impacts or harms, and they broadly conform with what Moss and al. State, which is that impacts are evaluative constructs that enabled institutions to coordinate action in order to identify, minimize, and mitigate harms. Now, a slight exception to this is the UAE Ethical AI Toolkit, which, although it is framed in a risk assessment style, it does include space for considering the scale and direction of the impact. For these more recent tools, although the focus is still on harms and negative impacts, there is active consideration of positive impacts through questions that specifically ask about benefits or considerations of best case scenarios, as well as the worst case ones. Even in this small sample, there's variation in the way that impact assessment is done. And AIAs are an emerging field, so it makes sense to take a step back and consider what is possible within the remit of impact assessments more generally. Reports, for example, from Data and Society or the Ada Lovelace Institute, they generally connect AIAs to influences from environmental impact assessments, privacy impact assessments, human rights-based impact assessments, but there are other types of impact assessments, particularly those found in responsible or inclusive business, as well as social impact assessment tools. And so I want to take a few moments now to dig into 3 examples from these realms and understand what impact means for them. The first is the B impact assessment. It's a publicly available free tool that organizations can use to measure, manage, and improve their positive impact. And for those who want to certify the process at a cost, they can join nearly 5,000 organizations as certified B Corps around the world. A couple of things to note about what impact means here. First, it's focused on positive impact, not simply complying with existing laws or norms. And secondly, B-Lab, which is the org behind the impact assessment, positions itself as part of a much broader impact movement that, quote, won't stop until all business is a force for good. This feels quite different to a risk management style of approach. Next up is the Future Fit Business Benchmark. And this is an open source tool developed to help companies understand how they're contributing to or undermining progress towards a flourishing future. The benchmark is also positioned as a movement, and impact is seen through 2 lenses. Firstly, break-even goals, which are a minimum standard when it comes to eliminating negative impacts. And secondly, positive pursuits, which can take on direct and indirect forms. And the indirect ones and the direct forms of these positive pursuits can be seen in the yellow boxes. A company can directly make positive impact itself, a company can reduce the negative impact of others, or a company can amplify the positive impact of others. Now, the third example is one seen in the New South Wales Government Department of Planning and Environment. And we've picked this as an example because it's aligned to the International Association of Impact Assessments, the Interorganisational Committee on Principles and Guidelines for Social Impact Assessment. Every project in New South Wales, and New South Wales is a state in Australia, that's deemed state significant, so think large infrastructure projects, is subject to a social impact assessment that follows this guideline. And the guideline's quite transparent about the meaning of impact. It defines it as both positive and negative, direct and indirect, tangible and intangible, and talks about not only the standalone impacts, but also cumulative ones. So we note here that these are just 3 examples. It's not an exhaustive or systematic exposition, but nevertheless, we've pulled out a few dimensions of impact that we've learned about through this small study. The first is a recognition that impact is not synonymous with harms or negative impacts. There is a spectrum of impact. It can range from negative to positive, and your interpretation depends where you are positioned in the system. The second is a dimension of proximity. Impact can be direct or first order, but there are also ripple effects that can emerge. And the third dimension is one of time. We can assess impacts in a standalone moment, and we can also assess impacts taking into account their cumulative effects. What we're seeing in algorithmic impact assessments so far is a definition of impact that sits broadly here, primarily focused on first order, standalone harms, with some glimmers of also encompassing benefits. Looking at other impact assessment examples shows a much broader view of impact that is largely neglected in current AIAs. Now, you might be asking, so what? Does it really matter what we consider an impact to be? And as a way of answering this so what question, I'm going to take a segue now into talking about Dr. Jenny Davis's mechanisms and conditions framework of affordances as a way of investigating the connection between object and action. So let's take a bit of a crash course on what we mean by affordances. Davis quotes Evan and Al's 2017 definition of affordance: the multifaceted relational structure between an object or technology and the use that enables or constrains potential behavioral outcomes in a particular context. So for Davis, the focus is on technologies as the artifact or object, but in our case, the object of interest is the algorithmic impact assessment, or impact assessments more broadly. So in between the features of an AIA and its outcomes or actions is affordances. And we can think of affordances as a magnifying glass, analysing how objects, in this case the AIA, shape action, or how an AIA can enable and constrain. Davis's framework operationalises this concept of affordances to include both the mechanisms, so how artifacts afford, as well as the conditions, which look at for whom and under what circumstances. Broadly speaking, the interaction between an object, in this case the AIA, and the subject, in this case a person undertaking an AIA, takes on 2 forms. There are bids and there are responses. Now, it's important to note that this diagram centers the artifact. It's asking how the artifact affords. So the artifact or the impact assessment, it can make a bid and the subject responds to that bid, or the subject can initiate the bid towards the artifact and the artifact initiates a response. There are different types of bids and responses that the artifact can initiate in varying degrees of intensity. So the impact assessment, as the object, it can allow a certain line of action, it can request it, and it can demand it. And these mechanisms of bidding are of increasing intensity. A request is optional, a demand is required. If we look at the response side, in our case, the subject that we'll be focusing on is the person responsible for conducting an AIA in an organisation. And in response, the AIA can allow this bid, it can encourage or discourage it, or it can refuse it. And these are also in increasing levels of intensity. How the mechanisms operate is dependent on the context or the conditions. And Davis describes these conditions in 3 realms. Firstly, perception, how people perceive a range of functions and constraints. Secondly, dexterity, so the level or skill a person has with the object. And finally, cultural and institutional legitimacy, which may impact the degree of support someone experiences to engage with the object. Let's apply this framework now to the different impact assessment examples that we've spoken about so far. So these are the examples we've spoken about so far on the left, and we'll start with the conditions. So the whom that we're interested in here is the person or team responsible for undertaking an impact assessment in a particular organization. Now, let's assume that the perceptions and dexterity of the person is similar, whether they're implementing an AIA or whether they're implementing a B impact assessment. Now, the cultural and institutional legitimacy is different. So algorithmic impact assessments are newer, they don't have as much legitimacy, but it is increasing, whereas something like a B Corp, B impact assessment is medium and increasing, and social impact assessments are sort of more stable and established. What we're going to focus in on is the mechanisms, and specifically understanding, firstly, how the impact assessment makes a bid in terms of negative or positive impacts, and secondly, how the impact assessment responds to a person coming into it with a compliance or risk-based mindset bid, or compared to someone who comes in with a bid that aims to move beyond compliance. As we've already mentioned, AIAs demand a focus on negative impacts. You can't really do the tool without identifying them, and they allow or request at best a consideration of positive impacts. Now, the future fit benchmark also demands a focus on negative impacts. Its break-even goals demand an elimination of negative impacts up to a certain threshold, and its positive pursuits request a focus on the positive impacts that can be made. For social impact assessments, looking at negative impacts and positive impacts are both requested. And for B Corps, negative impacts are allowed, but certainly not requested or demanded, and a focus on positive impacts is demanded. So you can see here that using this framework as a tool for analysis, there are nuances in how these impact assessments operate in terms of bids. If we were then to map the responses of an impact assessment, so we're considering a person comes to an impact assessment with a risk-based or compliance mindset, or comes with a motivation to move beyond compliance. In the case of AIA, if they come with a risk-based or compliance mindset, the AIA responds by encouraging this risk-based approach. If they come with a bid to move beyond compliance, the current configuration of AIAs would mean a response that allows it at best. In direct contrast, if we were to look at the B impact assessment, its response to a risk-based bid is that it's allowed, but its response to a bid that seeks to move beyond compliance is to encourage it. The future fit benchmark and the social impact assessment guidelines, their responses to both bids, both types of bids, risk and beyond compliance bids, is to encourage both. So using this tool, we could speculate that impact assessments that focus in on negative impacts are also ones that respond encouragingly to risk-based approaches, and impacts that give space to positive impacts encourage moves beyond compliance to broader senses of responsibility. Now, evidently, this is a constrained view. It has a bunch of limitations, and the interpretation of whether it's a demand or a request, it's blurry. But the framework does provide anchor points and a shared vocabulary for further debate and more questions, which brings us to the final considerations for the future of algorithmic impact assessments. We've attempted to show that AIAs are objects that shape our behaviour, and to date that impact has been considerably simplified in the context of AIAs to focus on negative, direct and standalone impacts. Other types of impact assessments, though, they consider expanded dimensions of impact. And we think that the current conceptualization of impact in AIAs shapes our behaviour towards compliance-based mindsets, which is important and valuable work, but we believe it shouldn't stop there. We speculate that expanded notions of impact could enable a move beyond risk to also encompass actions for wider responsibility. And we're left with a bunch of questions from this study that we'd be keen to discuss further. Questions like, how might we shift notions of impact and practically reflect them in AIAs? Who might we need to engage to think about impact differently? And how can we ensure that AIAs are feasible for a range of organisations, from large corporates and government orgs to community organisations and startups? We look forward to discussing these and more with you as we continue on a path towards responsible, sustainable, and safe algorithmic futures. Thank you very much.